The rain came down in cold sheets across the parking lot of the Riverside Inn, turning the cracked asphalt into a patchwork of shallow mirrors. Each droplet hit with the kind of relentless rhythm that wore a man down steady, indifferent, unforgiving. Ethan Cross sat on the curb outside room 114, his duffel bag soaked through, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. His broad shoulders were hunched against the weather, but not from the cold, from something heavier, something that had been building for months and had finally collapsed on him 3 hours ago. Beside him, pressed close against his left leg, sat Gunnar, a 4-year-old German shepherd, with a coat the color of smoke and amber eyes that never stopped watching. The dog's ears twitched with every passing car, every slam of a distant door, every shift in the wind. Gunnar had been with Ethan since Afghanistan. Through the noise and the fire and the long, empty nights that followed, through everything. Until now, Ethan had thought his wife would be part of everything, too. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog in the damp air. The wedding ring on his left hand caught the light from the motel, sign a pale gold band that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "You need to leave," that's what Caroline had said. Not yelled, not screamed, just said it, flat and final, standing in the doorway of her parents' house, with her arms folded and her eyes somewhere else, somewhere far away from him. "My parents think it's best if we take some space. You're not getting better, Ethan. You're not trying." He had tried to respond, tried to explain that PTSD didn't work on a schedule, didn't improve because someone wanted it to. But her father, Richard Holbrook, a man with a voice like gravel and a handshake that crushed bones, had stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "She's made her decision, son. Time for you to respect it." Son. The word had landed like a slap. Richard Holbrook had never called him son before. He'd called him the veteran. Caroline's project. And once, after too many drinks at Thanksgiving, the stray she dragged home. Ethan had stood there in the rain, Gunnar at his side, watching the door close, watching the lights go off, one by one, watching the life he thought he'd built disappear behind expensive curtains and locked doors. Now, he sat on a motel curb with $63 in his wallet and nowhere to go. Gunnar shifted closer, pressing his warm weight against Ethan's ribs. The dog's breathing was steady, calm, grounding. Ethan rested a hand on Gunnar's back, fingers curling into the damp fur. "Just you and me again, huh?" he murmured. Gunnar's tail thumped once against the wet pavement. A car door slammed nearby. Ethan looked up. A woman in her 60s stepped out of an old sedan, clutching a plastic folder against her chest to shield it from the rain. She wore a beige raincoat and wire-rimmed glasses that fogged slightly in the cold. Her expression was cautious, but determined, the look of someone who had driven too far to turn back now. She approached slowly, her eyes moving between Ethan and the dog. "Ethan Cross?" she called, over the sound of the rain. Ethan stood, instinctively placing himself between the woman and Gunnar. "Old habits." "Yeah, that's me." Gunnar rose too, body tense, ears forward. Not aggressive, evaluating. The woman stopped a few feet away, pulling an envelope from the folder. "My name is Helen Cartwright. I'm with Deschutes County Probate Services." She paused, studying him with something close to sympathy. "I've been trying to reach you for 2 weeks. Your phone's been disconnected." Ethan felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Bills. Debts. Something else he couldn't pay. "Look, if this is about, it's about your grandfather," Helen interrupted gently. "Thomas Cross." Ethan froze. He hadn't heard that name in years. Hadn't thought about the old man in longer than he cared to admit. His grandfather, a weathered rancher with hands like leather and a voice that rarely rose above a rumble, had been gone for nearly a decade. Or at least, Ethan thought he had been. He passed 6 weeks ago, Helen continued. I'm sorry for your loss. Ethan blinked. 6 weeks? He was living alone on his property. A neighbor found him. She held out the envelope. You're listed as his sole heir. The words didn't make sense. Sole heir. Ethan's father had died when he was 12. His mother had remarried and moved to Florida years ago. He had no siblings, no cousins, just nothing. And now, somehow, something. Gunnar nudged Ethan's hand with his nose, a gentle pressure that said, "Take it." Ethan reached for the envelope. His fingers were numb from the cold, and the paper felt stiff against his skin. Inside was a single document, a property deed, and a handwritten note on yellowed paper. The deed listed an address in eastern Oregon, Cross Creek Ranch, Harney County, 1,247 acres. The note, written in his grandfather's cramped, slanting handwriting, was short. Ethan, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've got nowhere else to go. Don't prove me wrong. The ranch is yours. It's not much, but it's paid for. There's a reason I never sold it. You'll understand when you get there. Grandpa Tom. Ethan read it twice. The tightness in his chest shifted into something else, something he couldn't name yet. Helen cleared her throat softly. The property taxes are current through the end of the year. After that, it's up to you. She handed him a set of keys on a faded leather strap. The house is old. No one's lived there since your grandfather's health declined. But it's structurally sound. Ethan stared at the keys. They were heavy, worn smooth by decades of use. There's one more thing, Helen added, her voice quieter now. Your grandfather left a message with our office. He said if you came looking for him, we should tell you this. The dog will know. Ethan's breath caught. He looked down at Gunnar. The dog's amber eyes were locked on Helen, ears pricked, body still. The dog will know, Ethan repeated slowly. Helen nodded. I don't know what it means. But he insisted. She stepped back toward her car, pulling her coat tighter. Good luck, Mr. Cross. I hope you find whatever he wanted you to find. She drove away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the rain with a duffel bag, a dog, and a set of keys that suddenly felt like a lifeline. Gunnar barked once, sharp, decisive. Ethan looked down at him. You think we should go? The dog's tail wagged. Not excited. Certain. Ethan exhaled, tucking the deed and note into his jacket. The rain was slowing now, tapering into a fine mist that clung to everything. He looked toward the highway stretching east into the mountains, into the high desert, into a place he hadn't been since he was a boy. All right, he said quietly. Let's see what the old man left us. He shouldered his duffel. Gunnar fell into step beside him, and together they walked toward the truck he'd been sleeping in for the past 3 nights, a battered Ford Ranger with rusted wheel wells and a cracked windshield. As he climbed behind the wheel, Gunnar jumped into the passenger seat and sat upright, staring straight ahead like a soldier ready for deployment. Ethan started the engine. The heater sputtered to life, blowing cold air that would eventually turn warm. He pulled onto the highway, heading east, leaving the Riverside Inn and the Holbrook family and everything that had broken behind him. The road stretched long and empty ahead. The mountains rose in the distance, dark against the gray sky. And somewhere out there, buried in the high desert, was a ranch that had been waiting for him. A ranch that remembered what people forgot. The drive took 8 hours. Highway 26 cut through the Cascade Range, winding past dense forests of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine before descending into the wide, open expanse of eastern Oregon. The landscape changed slowly green, giving way to brown, trees thinning into scrub brush, rivers narrowing into dry creek beds. By the time Ethan reached Harney County, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting long golden shadows across the sagebrush. The air smelled different here. Dry, sharp, tinged with juniper and dust. It was the smell of his childhood, buried under years of deployments and cities, and other people's lives. He followed the directions Helen had written on the back of the envelope. The highway turned into a county road. The county road turned into gravel, and the gravel turned into two faint tire tracks, cutting through tall grass and scattered stones. Then he saw it. Cross Creek Ranch sat at the base of a low ridge, framed by distant buttes, and a sky so wide it felt like the earth had cracked open. The main house was a single-story structure with weathered cedar siding that had turned silver gray with age. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and several of the windows were boarded up. A narrow porch ran along the front, its railing half collapsed. Behind the house stood a massive barn, red paint peeling in long strips, exposing sun-bleached wood underneath. The doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. A windmill stood nearby, its blades frozen in place, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. Ethan killed the engine and sat there, staring. It was worse than he remembered. Or maybe it had always been this way, and he'd been too young to see it. Gunnar shifted in the passenger seat, ears swiveling toward the barn. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, not a growl, but something close. Awareness. "What is it?" Ethan murmured. The dog's gaze didn't waver. His body was tense, tail stiff, nostrils flaring as he scented something Ethan couldn't detect. Ethan opened the door and stepped out. The wind hit him immediately, cold, dry, carrying the smell of sage and something faintly metallic. Gunnar jumped down beside him, circling once before moving toward the barn with deliberate, measured steps. "Hold on," Ethan called. "Let me check the house first." Gunnar stopped, looking back at him with an expression that was almost human. Impatient, urgent, but he obeyed. Ethan walked up the porch steps. The wood groaned under his weight, and he tested each board before putting his full weight on it. The front door was unlocked, just like his grandfather had always left it. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the boarded windows, illuminating a sparse living room. A worn couch, a wood stove, a small kitchen table with two chairs. Everything was covered in a fine layer of grime, as if time itself had settled here and refused to move. On the kitchen table sat a single item, a photograph in a cracked frame. Ethan picked it up carefully. The image showed a younger version of his grandfather standing in front of the barn, one hand resting on the shoulder of a boy. Ethan recognized himself, maybe 10 years old, skinny, grinning, holding a fishing pole. He didn't remember the moment, but he remembered the feeling. Safe, wanted, home. His throat tightened. A sharp bark cut through the silence. "Gunnar." Ethan set the photograph down and moved quickly to the door. Gunnar was standing at the barn entrance, body rigid, ears pinned forward. He barked again, 3 short, sharp bursts. His warning signal, Ethan's pulse kicked. He crossed the yard in long strides, boots crunching on dry grass. "What did you find?" Gunnar didn't look at him. He was staring at the barn doors, scratching at the gap between them with one paw. His breathing was fast, controlled, focused. Ethan grabbed the edge of the door and pulled. The hinges screamed in protest, but the door swung open, flooding the interior with pale afternoon light. The barn was cavernous, high rafters, empty stalls, scattered tools rusted beyond use. Dust motes drifted through the sunlight like snow. The floor was hard-packed earth, uneven and cracked with age. And in the far corner, partially hidden beneath a tarp, was a workbench. Gunnar moved toward it immediately. Nose low, tail stiff. He circled the bench once, then sat down directly in front of it and stared at Ethan. The dog will know. Ethan's skin prickled. He approached slowly, heart pounding. The tarp was old canvas, brittle and stiff. He pulled it away carefully. Beneath it, the workbench was cluttered with tools, wrenches, hammers, coils of wire. But in the center, half buried under loose dirt and sawdust, was a small metal box. Ethan lifted it out. It was heavy, cold, locked with a simple padlock that had rusted through. He twisted the lock, and it broke apart in his hands. Inside the box was a leather journal, its cover cracked and faded. On the first page, in his grandfather's handwriting, were the words, "For Ethan, when the world takes everything, the land gives back." Ethan opened the journal with trembling hands. The pages were filled with dates, notes, coordinates, and on the third page, a single line that stopped his breath. "If they come looking, the truth is buried where the old foundation lies. $298 million. Hidden 1,979. Not stolen, protected." Ethan stared at the words until they blurred. $298 million. Gunnar barked once, pulling him back. The dog was staring at the floor now, pawing at a section of earth that looked slightly different, darker, more compact. Ethan knelt beside him. The dirt was packed tight, but not naturally. Something had been buried here, recently disturbed, and then carefully covered again. He looked back at the journal, at the coordinates written in the margins, and he realized with a cold, sinking certainty his grandfather hadn't just left him a ranch, he'd left him a secret, a fortune, and a fight. Because, if the journal was right, someone else already knew. And they were coming. Ethan spent the next 2 hours exploring the ranch. Gunnar never more than a few feet away. The house was livable, barely. The roof didn't leak. The wood stove still worked, and the well pump sputtered to life after a few hard cranks. He found canned goods in the cupboard. Their labels faded, but seals intact. His grandfather had prepared for someone to come back. He'd prepared for Ethan. As the sun began to set, casting the high desert in shades of burnt orange and deep purple, Ethan sat on the porch steps with the journal open on his lap. Gunnar lay beside him, head resting on his paws, amber eyes watching the horizon. The journal was meticulous. His grandfather had documented everything: dates, transactions, names, and as Ethan read, the story began to take shape. In 1979, Thomas Cross had worked as a security contractor for a private logistics company called Summit Holdings. They'd been hired to transport a shipment of bearer bonds and cash payment for a government land deal that had been quietly negotiated during the Carter administration. The shipment was worth $298 million, but the deal had been dirty. The land in question, thousands of acres of mineral-rich territory in Nevada, had been sold to a shell corporation controlled by a man named Victor Pembroke, a real estate mogul with ties to organized crime. The payment was supposed to disappear into offshore accounts, far from federal oversight. Thomas Cross had been the driver, and when he'd realized what he was transporting, when he'd understood that the money wasn't just dirty, it was stolen from veterans' benefits and housing programs, he'd made a choice. He'd hidden it. He'd buried it on his own land, in a place no one would think to look. And then he'd disappeared, leaving Summit Holdings and Victor Pembroke scrambling to cover their tracks. For 40 years, the money had stayed hidden. And for 40 years, Thomas Cross had lived quietly on his ranch, watching, waiting, knowing that someday someone would come looking. Ethan closed the journal, his hands shaking. His grandfather hadn't been a thief. He'd been a protector. He'd taken the money to keep it out of the hands of people who would have used it to hurt others. And now it was Ethan's burden to carry. Gunnar lifted his head suddenly, ears swiveling toward the gravel road. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan stood, heart pounding. In the distance, a pair of headlights cut through the gathering dusk. A vehicle was approaching, moving slowly, deliberately. Not a neighbor, not a lost traveler, someone who knew exactly where they were going. Ethan moved into the house, grabbed the hunting rifle he'd found in the closet, and checked the chamber. Loaded. His grandfather had left that behind too. Gunnar positioned himself at the edge of the porch, body low, ready. The vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows, pulled to a stop 50 yards from the house. The engine idled for a long moment. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, mid-50s, with silver hair swept back, and a charcoal overcoat that didn't belong in the high desert. His face was smooth, expressionless, the kind of face that had practiced neutrality until it became permanent. He walked forward slowly, hands raised slightly to show they were empty. "Ethan Cross," he called. His voice was calm, measured, almost friendly. Ethan didn't answer. The man stopped 20 feet away. "My name is Lawrence Pembroke. I believe you've recently inherited this property from your grandfather." Pembroke. The name hit Ethan like a punch. Victor Pembroke's son. "I don't want any trouble," Lawrence continued. "I'm here to make you an offer. A generous one." Gunnar's growl deepened. Lawrence glanced at the dog, then back at Ethan. "Your grandfather took something that didn't belong to him. I'm willing to pay you well to return it." "Very well. Enough to set you up for life." Ethan's grip tightened on the rifle. "Get off my land." Lawrence's expression didn't change. "You don't understand the situation you're in. My family has been looking for that money for 4 decades. We're not going to stop now." "Then you're wasting your time," Ethan said evenly, "because I don't know what you're talking about." Lawrence smiled faintly. It didn't reach his eyes. "Your wife, Caroline, isn't it? She mentioned you'd inherited a ranch. Strange coincidence, her parents suggesting you leave right after your grandfather's death." Ethan's blood turned to ice. Lawrence continued. "The Holbrooks are reasonable people. They understand the value of cooperation. You should too. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a choice." Lawrence pulled a business card from his pocket and set it on a fence post. "Think it over. I'll be in touch." He walked back to the SUV, climbed in, and drove away, leaving only a trail of dust in his wake. Ethan stood there, shaking with rage and something colder fear. Not for himself, for Caroline, for what the Pembrokes might do if they thought she knew something. Gunnar pressed against his leg, grounding him. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think clearly. The Pembrokes knew he was here. They knew about the money, and they'd been watching long enough to know when his grandfather died and when Ethan would inherit the ranch, which meant they'd been patient, calculated, dangerous. But they didn't know where the money was buried. Not yet. And Ethan had something they didn't. Gunnar. He looked down at the dog. Gunnar's amber eyes were steady, unwavering. "All right, boy," Ethan whispered. "Let's find out what Grandpa hid." That night, Ethan slept fitfully on the old couch, the rifle within arm's reach. Gunnar lay on the floor beside him, ears twitching at every sound. The creak of settling wood, the rustle of wind through the eaves, the distant cry of a coyote. When dawn broke, pale and cold, Ethan was already awake. He made instant coffee on the wood stove, the bitter smell cutting through the musty air. Outside, frost clung to the grass, turning the landscape into something brittle and glass-like. He stood at the window, watching the sun climb slowly over the ridge, painting the buttes in shades of rose and gold. Gunnar scratched at the door, impatient. Ethan pulled on his jacket and followed the dog outside. Gunnar didn't head toward the barn this time. He moved around the side of the house, nose to the ground, tracking something only he could sense. Ethan followed, boots crunching on frozen earth. Gunnar led him past the windmill, past the remains of an old corral, to a section of ground where the soil looked different, darker, more compact, as if it had been turned over and then left to settle. Ethan knelt, running his fingers through the dirt. It was loose beneath the surface, recently disturbed. He looked at the journal notes again. Where the old foundation lies, this wasn't the barn. This was something else. He began to dig with his hands, then found a rusted shovel leaning against a nearby post. Gunnar sat back, watching intently, tail swishing. Ethan dug carefully, methodically. 6 inches down, the shovel hit something solid. Metal. He cleared away more dirt, revealing the edge of a steel plate. It was rectangular, about 2 feet by 3 feet, bolted into a concrete foundation that extended deep into the earth. His heart pounded. This was it. He pried at the edges with a crowbar, working slowly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Finally, the plate shifted. He lifted it away, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. A ladder, old, rusted, but still intact, clung to the side of the shaft. Gunnar barked once, sharp and clear. Ethan grabbed a flashlight from his truck and shone it down into the hole. The beam caught the rungs of the ladder, then the floor below a small underground chamber, maybe 8 feet deep. He looked at Gunnar. The dog's tail wagged once. Ethan climbed down first, testing each rung before putting his weight on it. The air below was cold and damp, smelling of earth and old concrete. When his boots hit the floor, he swept the flashlight around. The chamber was small, no bigger than a closet. But in the center, stacked neatly against the wall, were metal crates, military surplus, marked with stenciled numbers. Ethan's breath caught. He opened the first crate carefully. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and plastic, were bundles of cash, $100 bills, pristine, untouched by time. Beneath the cash were bearer bonds, their edges yellowed, but seals intact. He opened the second crate. More cash, more bonds. And the third? And the fourth? $298 million. His grandfather hadn't been exaggerating. Ethan sat back on his heels, staring at the fortune in front of him. His hands were trembling. His mind was racing. This wasn't just money. This was leverage, power, a way to fight back against the Pembrokes, the Holbrooks, everyone who had ever told him he wasn't enough. But it was also a target. Gunnar barked from above, 3 short, sharp bursts. Ethan scrambled up the ladder. Gunnar was standing at the edge of the clearing, body rigid, ears pinned forward. In the distance, dust rose from the gravel road. Multiple vehicles. Moving fast. Ethan cursed under his breath. The Pembrokes weren't wasting time. He climbed out of the shaft, replaced the steel plate, and kicked dirt over it. It wouldn't fool anyone for long, but it might buy him minutes. "Inside," he ordered. Gunnar obeyed instantly. Ethan grabbed the rifle and positioned himself near the window. 3 SUVs pulled into the yard, forming a loose semicircle around the house. Doors opened. 6 men stepped out, broad-shouldered, unsmiling, dressed in tactical gear that didn't belong on a ranch. Lawrence Pembroke emerged last, adjusting his coat as if he'd just arrived at a business meeting. He walked toward the house with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. "Mr. Cross," he called, "let's talk like reasonable men." Ethan didn't answer. Lawrence stopped at the base of the porch steps. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to resolve this situation peacefully. My father made mistakes. I'm trying to correct them. By threatening me? By offering you a way out." Lawrence's tone was patient, condescending. "You're a veteran. You've seen enough violence. You don't want this fight." Ethan's finger hovered near the trigger. "Then leave. Lawrence sighed. I can't do that. He gestured to one of his men, a tall, lean figure with a shaved head and a tactical vest. The man moved toward the barn. Gunnar erupted into barking loud, aggressive, furious. Ethan stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. Call him off. Lawrence smiled faintly. Or what? You'll shoot me? That's not who you are, Ethan. You're not a killer. You don't know what I am. The man reached the barn door. He pulled it open and disappeared inside. Ethan's chest tightened. If they found the journal, if they found evidence of the chamber, Gunnar lunged forward, but Ethan grabbed his collar. Stay. The dog obeyed, trembling with barely restrained energy. Minutes passed. Then the man emerged from the barn, shaking his head. He called to Lawrence. Nothing. Just tools. Lawrence's expression flickered annoyance, frustration. He looked back at Ethan. Where is it? I don't know what you're talking about. Lawrence stepped closer. My family has been very patient, but patience has limits. Gunnar growled low, teeth bared. Lawrence glanced at the dog. Impressive animal? Military trained, I assume? His eyes hardened. Would be a shame if something happened to him. Ethan's vision went red. He raised the rifle higher. Get off my land. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lawrence raised a hand, signaling his men. We're leaving. For now. They climbed back into the SUVs and drove away, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air. Ethan didn't lower the rifle until the last vehicle disappeared over the ridge. Then he sank onto the porch steps, shaking. Gunnar pressed against him, warm and solid, a reminder that he wasn't alone. We can't stay here, Ethan whispered. Not like this. But leaving wasn't an option either. Not with $298 million buried beneath his feet. He needed help. He needed allies. And he knew exactly where to find them. The Harney County Sheriff's Office sat on the edge of the town of Burns, a modest brick building with a faded flag hanging limply from a pole out front. Ethan parked his truck in the gravel lot. Gunnar sitting upright in the passenger seat, watching every person who walked by. Inside, the office smelled of old coffee and paper. A dispatcher, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes. Can I help you? I need to speak to the sheriff, Ethan said. It's about my grandfather. Thomas Cross. Her expression shifted recognition, sympathy. You're Tom's grandson? Yes, ma'am. She picked up the phone, spoke quietly, then nodded toward a hallway. Sheriff Grady will see you now. Ethan walked down the narrow corridor, Gunnar at his heel. At the end, a door stood open, revealing a small office cluttered with files and maps. Behind the desk sat a woman in her late 50s, compact and wiry, with short gray hair and sharp blue eyes. She wore a tan uniform, the sleeves rolled up, and a badge that glinted under the fluorescent lights. Sheriff Nora Grady stood, extending a hand. Ethan Cross. Your grandfather talked about you. Ethan shook her hand, surprised by the strength of her grip. He did? Every time I saw him. She gestured to a chair. Sit. Tell me what's going on. Ethan sat, and Gunnar settled at his feet. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. Someone's been threatening me. A man named Lawrence Pembroke. He claims my grandfather took something from his family. Grady's eyes narrowed. Pembroke? You know him? Of him? She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. The Pembrokes are old money. Real estate, development, mining. They've got connections in Portland, Washington, even overseas. Not the kind of people you want as enemies. They've already made themselves my enemies, Ethan said flatly. They showed up at my ranch? With armed men. Grady's jaw tightened. Did they threaten you directly? They threatened my dog. She glanced down at Gunnar, who was watching her with calm, steady eyes. That's a line they shouldn't have crossed. Ethan pulled out his grandfather's journal and set it on the desk. My grandfather left me this. He documented everything. Dates, names, transactions. In 1979, he was hired to transport a shipment of money. He realized it was stolen from veterans' benefits programs, so he hid it. Grady opened the journal, scanning the pages. Her expression grew darker with each line. $298 million. Yes, ma'am. She set the journal down carefully. If this is true, if your grandfather really hid that money, then you're sitting on evidence of one of the biggest financial crimes in Oregon history. I know, and the Pembrokes won't stop until they get it back. I know that too. Grady studied him for a long moment. What do you want from me, Ethan? Protection. Witnesses. Help getting this money back to the people it was stolen from. She leaned forward. You understand what you're asking? The Pembrokes have lawyers, influence, money. They'll bury you in paperwork and legal threats before you ever see a courtroom. Then we don't go through the courts, Ethan said quietly. We go through the press. We go public. Grady's eyes sharpened. You're talking about forcing their hand. I'm talking about doing what my grandfather would have done. Ethan's voice was steady now, resolute. He protected that money for 40 years. I'm not going to let it disappear into the hands of the people who stole it in the first place. Grady was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. All right, I'll help you. But we do this carefully. No cowboys, no risks. We document everything. We bring in the feds, and we make sure you don't end up dead in a ditch. Ethan exhaled, relief flooding through him. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. She stood, grabbing her hat from the desk. First, we need to secure that money. Then, we need to find someone who can verify your grandfather's story. You got a name? Someone who worked with him back then? Ethan flipped through the journal. Frank Delacroix. He was a driver for Summit Holdings, too. Grady's expression shifted. Delacroix. I know that name. He lives over in John Day, runs a gas station. He's still alive? Last I heard. She grabbed her keys. Let's go talk to him. The drive to John Day took 2 hours. The highway cutting through sagebrush flats and rolling hills dotted with juniper. Gunner rode in the back seat of the sheriff's cruiser, head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. Grady drove in silence for most of the trip, occasionally glancing at Ethan in the rearview mirror. Finally, she spoke. Your grandfather was a good man, stubborn as hell, but good. He used to come into town once a month, buy supplies, check in, never caused trouble. Did he ever talk about the money? Ethan asked. Not directly, but he always said the same thing. The land remembers what people forget. She smiled faintly. Guess he was right. They pulled into John Day just as the sun was setting. The gas station sat on the edge of town, a small cinder-block building with a hand-painted sign that read, Delacroix's Fuel and Repair. An old man in grease-stained coveralls was locking the front door when they arrived. He was tall, thin, with a shock of white hair and a face lined by decades of hard living. When he saw the sheriff's cruiser, he froze. Grady stepped out. Frank Delacroix? The man's eyes flicked between her and Ethan. I didn't do nothing. Relax, Grady said gently. We're here about Thomas Cross. Frank's expression shifted surprise, then something darker. Yes, Ethan said, stepping forward. I'm his grandson. Frank studied him. You look like him. Same eyes. He glanced at Gunner, who was sitting calmly at Ethan's side. And you've got his dog. This is Gunner. He's mine. Frank nodded slowly. Tom always said you'd come back someday. Didn't think it'd be after he was gone, though. Ethan pulled out the journal. He left me this. I need to know if it's true. The money. Summit Holdings. 1,979. Frank's face went pale. He unlocked the door to the gas station and gestured them inside. "You better come in." They sat in the small office, surrounded by stacks of invoices and calendars from decades past. Frank poured coffee into chipped mugs and handed them out. "I haven't thought about Summit in 40 years, he said quietly. Tried not to. "What happened?" Grady asked. Frank sighed. "We were drivers. Me and Tom. Hauling cargo for private clients, no questions asked. Most of it was legal construction equipment, supplies. But in '79, they gave us a special job. High security. Armed escorts. We were told it was a government contract. But it wasn't," Ethan said. Frank shook his head. "We found out halfway through the run." Tom got suspicious, checked the manifest. Turned out we were hauling stolen funds. Money skimmed from veterans programs, housing loans, disability payments, millions of dollars. And it was all going to Victor Pembroke's people. "What did you do?" "I wanted to turn it in. Go to the feds." But Tom said we'd end up dead before we ever made it to a federal building. Frank's hands shook slightly. "So he made a choice. He took the shipment, hid it, and he told me to disappear." "Did you?" "I changed my name. Moved out here. Kept my head down." Tom stayed on his ranch, waiting. He always believed someday the truth would come out. Grady leaned forward. "Would you testify to that? On the record?" Frank hesitated. "If I do, they'll come after me." "They're already coming after Ethan," Grady said. "If we don't stop them now, they'll keep coming." Frank looked at Ethan. Really looked at him. "You're serious about this? About exposing them?" "I am." Frank was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right. I'll testify." For Tom, Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. "Thank you." Frank stood, pulling a dusty box from under his desk. "I kept copies, records, manifests, photos. Tom told me to hold on to them just in case." He handed the box to Ethan. "Guess this is just in case." They drove back to Cross Creek Ranch under a sky full of stars. Gunnar slept in the back seat, exhausted from the long day. Ethan stared out the window, thinking about his grandfather, about the choices he'd made, the risks he'd taken, the years he'd spent alone, protecting something bigger than himself. When they arrived at the ranch, Grady helped Ethan carry the boxes inside. She stood in the doorway, looking around the small, weathered house. "You planning to stay here?" she asked. "For now. The Pembrokes won't stop. You know that." "I know." She handed him a business card. "Call me if anything happens. Anything. I'll have a deputy swing by twice a day to check on you." "I appreciate it." Grady glanced down at Gunnar, who had positioned himself near the door, ever watchful. "Take care of that dog. He's smarter than most people I know." Ethan smiled faintly. "He always has been." After Grady left, Ethan sat on the porch steps, the night air cold and still. Gunnar lay beside him, head resting on Ethan's knee. "We're going to win this," Ethan whispered. "For Grandpa. For everyone they stole from." Gunnar's tail thumped once against the wood, and in the darkness, Ethan felt something shift. Not fear, not doubt, purpose. The next 3 days passed in tense preparation. Ethan cataloged the evidence from Frank's box, cross-referencing it with his grandfather's journal. Grady brought in a federal investigator from the Portland office, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Torres, who listened to Ethan's story without interruption, took copies of everything, and promised to move quickly. But the Pembrokes moved quicker. On the 4th morning, Ethan woke to the sound of Gunnar barking loud, frantic, aggressive. He grabbed the rifle and ran outside. The barn was on fire. Flames licked up the sides of the old structure, black smoke billowing into the pale dawn sky. Ethan ran toward it, but the heat was already too intense. He could hear the roar of the fire, the crackle of wood collapsing. Gunnar barked again, pulling at Ethan's pant leg, dragging him backward. And that's when Ethan saw them, 3 figures standing at the edge of the property, watching. Lawrence Pembroke's men. Ethan's rage boiled over. He raised the rifle, but they were already retreating, climbing into a truck that sped away before he could react. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the barn was gone, reduced to charred beams and ash. Ethan stood in the smoking ruins, fists clenched. Gunnar pressed against his leg. Sheriff Grady arrived an hour later, her face grim. "I heard. I'm sorry, Ethan. They're trying to scare me." "It's working." "No," Ethan said, voice hard. "It's making me angrier." Grady studied him. "Agent Torres wants to move up the timeline. She's ready to bring in the FBI, freeze the Pembroke assets, start building a case. But she needs one thing." "What?" "The money. She needs to see it. Verify it's real." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then let's show her." That afternoon, Agent Torres arrived with a team of forensic accountants and federal marshals. Ethan led them to the underground chamber, Gunnar at his side. When they opened the crates, Torres let out a low whistle. Jesus. The accountants went to work immediately, photographing, cataloging, verifying. It took 6 hours. When they finished, Torres pulled Ethan aside. "It's real. Every dollar. And the bonds are still valid. So what happens now?" "Now we freeze the Pembroke accounts, file federal charges, and bring this to a grand jury. With Frank Delacroix's testimony and your grandfather's documentation, we have enough to put Lawrence Pembroke away for a long time." Ethan exhaled. "Good." Torres's expression softened. "You did the right thing, Mr. Cross. Not many people would. I'm just finishing what my grandfather started." She nodded. He'd be proud. The next morning, federal agents raided the Pembroke estate in Portland. Lawrence Pembroke was arrested at his office, led out in handcuffs in front of news cameras. The story broke nationally within hours. $298 million stolen from veterans found buried on Oregon ranch. Whistleblower veteran exposes decades-old crime. Ethan watched the news from the ranch. Gunnar curled at his feet. His phone rang constantly. Reporters, lawyers, people wanting interviews. He ignored them all, except for one call. Caroline. Her voice was small, hesitant. "Ethan?" "Yeah. I saw the news. I didn't know. My parents? They? I know," Ethan said quietly. "They were working with Pembroke." She was silent for a long moment. "I'm so sorry. Are you safe?" "I'm staying with a friend. I left my parents' house." "Good. Ethan, can we talk? In person?" He looked down at Gunnar. The dog's amber eyes were calm, steady, waiting. "Not yet," Ethan said gently. "I need time." "I understand." Her voice broke. "I love you." He closed his eyes. "I know." He hung up. Gunnar nudged his hand, and Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears. "Just you and me, huh?" Gunnar's tail wagged. 6 months later, Cross Creek Ranch looked different. The burned barn had been replaced with a new structure. Cedar-sided, sturdy. Built by volunteers from the local veterans community. The house had been repaired, the roof patched, the windows replaced. A new windmill turned slowly in the breeze, pulling water from the well. And in the cleared field behind the house, a sign stood tall. Cross Creek Veterans Sanctuary, founded in memory of Thomas Cross. Ethan stood on the porch, watching the first group of veterans arrive, men and women carrying duffel bags, trauma, hope. Gunnar sat beside him, tail wagging as a young Marine knelt to greet him. Sheriff Grady climbed the porch steps, a cup of coffee in hand. "You did good, Ethan." "Grandpa did good," he corrected. "I'm just following through." She smiled. He'd still be proud. The $298 million had been returned to the federal programs it was stolen, from veterans' housing, disability benefits, education funds. Ethan had kept none of it. He didn't need it. The ranch was enough. Agent Torres had helped him set up the sanctuary, funded by donations and grants. It was small, but growing. A place for veterans to heal, to rebuild, to find purpose again, just like Ethan had. Gunnar barked once, pulling Ethan's attention to the driveway. A familiar sedan pulled up, and Frank Delacroix stepped out, grinning. "Figured I'd stop by," Frank called. "See what you've done with the place." Ethan walked down to meet him, shaking his hand. "Glad you're here." Frank looked around, nodding approvingly. "Tom would have loved this." "Not. Tom would have loved this." "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "I think he would." As the sun set, painting the high desert in shades of gold and amber, Ethan sat on the porch with Gunnar at his side. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, alive with the kind of stillness that comes after a storm. He thought about his grandfather, about the man who had chosen integrity over wealth, courage over comfort, who had protected something precious for 40 years, waiting for someone to carry it forward. And Ethan had. Gunnar rested his head on Ethan's knee, eyes half closed, content. "We made it, boy," Ethan whispered. "We're home." The wind carried the scent of sage and juniper, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. The land remembered what people forgot, and Cross Creek Ranch would make sure they never forgot again.